The first snow of dawn fell like a veil of silence, smothering the earth beneath a hushed blanket that seemed woven from secrets the sky longed to keep. It clung to the beams of the railway station, turning rough wood pale, softening wagon tracks into ghostly scars, swallowing every echo until only the rhythm of breath and heartbeat remained. The crowd gathered under the eaves leaned forward, their faces half hidden in scarves and shadows, yet their voices were sharp enough to pierce the storm. They whispered, they judged, they laughed, and though the air burned with winter's frost, their words cut deeper than the wind ever could. They had come not for warmth or wonder, but for spectacle. The train arriving, its steam unfurling like a serpent, its doors opening to release a procession of weary women whose futures would be claimed by hands that weighed them like goods in a market. Men with dust on their boots, with hunger in their eyes, store clerks too soft for the land, widowers clutching children's hands, each one studied the women as though choosing a coat for winter or a horse for the trail. A nod was a claim, a glance, a bargain, a hand outstretched a binding. But among them stood a man no one dared to reach for. Taller than the rest, broader than the threshold of any door, his shoulders carved from years of storms, his chest bronzed and scarred with the memory of survival. His coat, fur-lined and heavy, could not diminish the raw power of his frame. He stood bare beneath it, as if to challenge the snow to strike him harder, as if to say the world had failed to break him before and it would fail again. His long, dark hair gathered flakes of white, and though the cold licked his skin, he remained unmoving, like a mountain that would not bow to the wind. Whispers crawled through the crowd, brittle as sleet. Too tall, too savage, too much for any woman to climb like a ladder just to kiss. Laughter rippled, cruel and thin, feeding on itself. Children mimicked, women smirked, men traded smirks like knives. But he did not answer. He carried silence the way others carried weapons, not to wound, but to survive. His gaze fixed only on the line of women descending from the train, each one stepping into the hush of snow with eyes darting, searching, hoping. Yet one after another turned from him, one recoiling as if struck by his shadow, another pressing a prayer to her lips, a third laughing aloud as though his stature was fit only for ridicule. Their refusals fell like stones upon the stillness of his chest, heavy, unrelenting, yet he bore them without a flinch. He was not a man, they thought, but a spectre too large for belonging, a giant meant only to stand apart. And still he waited. Still he endured their scorn, his frame haloed in falling white, his silence colder than the storm itself. The station's air thickened with derision until only one young woman lingered when all others had been chosen, their hands pulled into bargains of necessity and fear. She was not adorned like the rest, her shawl frayed, her boots patched, her hair loose and unkempt, her lips raw with cold. At only 20 years, her eyes carried the ache of being left behind too many times to count. Yet in their depths flickered a fire no storm could snuff out. She had been overlooked by ranchers, dismissed by shopkeepers, scorned by women who whispered she would not last till spring. She stood alone, snow gathering on her lashes, her small hand gripping the strap of a worn satchel as though clinging to the last thread of dignity. And then her gaze found him. She saw not the giant mocked by others, not the silence mistaken for savagery, but the stillness of a man who had carried rejection like a second skin. Where others had recoiled, she stepped closer. Her breath trembled in the air, a fragile mist, yet her voice cut through the storm, soft but certain, carrying like a bell struck in the night. "You're mine now." The world fractured in that instant. The ledger slipped from Amelia Hensley's hands, gasps cracked open the hush, and children stilled mid-play, their eyes wide with shock. Even the sheriff's jaw clenched as though he had witnessed something forbidden. But Olivia did not falter. She reached her hand toward him, pale against the enormity of his shadow, offering not pity nor desperation, but choice. For the first time in years, his breath broke sharply, as though life had returned to a drowning man. His scarred palm rose, engulfing hers, not to claim, not to crush, but to hold with reverence. The silence that followed was louder than the cruelest laughter, thick as the snow that veiled them. And in that silence the crowd scattered, muttering that such unions never endured, that no warmth could be kindled from mismatched souls. Yet as the whistle shrieked and the train vanished into the white horizon, two figures remained, one too feared to be chosen, the other too plain to be wanted, standing hand in hand against the scorn of the world. That was how it began. A love not born from bargains or blessings, but from defiance. A whispered vow in the snow, fragile yet fierce. A healing touch that wrapped the wounded silence of one life in the steady courage of another. Their story was never meant to be easy, never meant to escape judgment, but in the storm's heart lay a seed of warmth, small enough to be ignored by the world, strong enough to outlast it. And as we journey through their trials and tenderness, through whispers and battles, through the soft fire of healing love that binds them, I invite you to walk beside them. Share your thoughts. Leave your heart in words. Let your spirit linger here by liking, by commenting, by subscribing, so that together we keep alive the light of stories that remind us love is not measured by what others say, but by what two souls choose when the world turns cold. The snow thickened that morning, wrapping them in a veil only they could step beneath. And though the town turned away, the first step toward a bond unbreakable had already been taken. Their journey did not end on that platform. It was only the beginning, a path that led into the wilderness, where the fire of choice would be tested against the cold silence of judgment, and where the healing warmth of love would either falter or blaze eternal. The wagon groaned under the weight of snow as it rolled from the station, its wheels carving tracks that vanished almost as soon as they were made. Olivia sat beside the giant, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, yet the cold crept through the thin cloth, needling her bones until her teeth clenched with each shiver. He did not speak. His silence was not one of indifference, but of endurance, as though words were a luxury he had never been granted. His large hands guided the reins with steady precision, and though the wind lashed, though the storm pressed against them like a wall, he did not falter. The fur of his coat shifted as he leaned ever so slightly toward her, shielding her from the cruelest of the gusts without acknowledgement, as though kindness was an instinct too ingrained to be named. The wilderness stretched before them, an endless expanse of white and shadow. Pines bent beneath the weight of snow, their branches groaning with the burden, and the sky sank low, grey and unforgiving. Olivia's breath fogged the air in fragile clouds, and her eyes stung with the effort to stay fixed on the path. She wondered if he could hear her heartbeat in the silence between hoofbeats, wondered if he felt the tremor in her hand as it clutched the satchel on her lap. She studied him from the corner of her gaze, the slope of his shoulders, the scars etched into his chest, the way he held himself with a stillness that seemed carved from stone. He looked like a man who belonged to the wilderness, whose silence was as much a part of him as the snow was part of winter. By the time the cabin appeared at the edge of the woods, dusk had already pressed its blue shadows against the horizon. The roof was crusted with snow, the logs weather-darkened, smoke trailing faintly from the chimney like a sigh against the storm. He pulled the horses to a halt, leapt down with the grace of someone too accustomed to harsh land, and turned to lift her from the wagon. His hands, rough and scarred, were startlingly gentle as they steadied her onto the icy ground, lingering just long enough to ensure her footing. She whispered a soft thank you, her voice trembling in the air, but he gave no reply, only opened the cabin door for her to enter first, as though her presence had changed the threshold forever. Inside, the air was heavy with pine resin and the faint smoke of a fire long burned low. A bearskin rug sprawled across the floor, its glass eyes dulled by time, and stacks of wood lined the walls in neat rows that spoke of meticulous preparation. The bed was narrow, the table smaller still, as though a life of solitude had demanded little more than necessity. Olivia placed her satchel down with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the small space that now seemed vast with the presence of two. She realized in that moment how little this place had been meant to hold more than one life, and how sharply her own solitude mirrored his. He moved with deliberate quiet, kneeling to feed kindling into the fire until sparks leapt and warmth began to crawl through the chill. Shadows painted his features in sharp lines, the flames flickering across scars that told stories of battles she would never fully know. She lingered near the door, clutching her shawl, unsure if she belonged to this space or if she was trespassing on something sacred. At last he turned, his dark eyes steady, and motioned toward the fire. She obeyed, lowering herself onto the bearskin, the roughness of it prickling against her palms. He disappeared into the corner and returned with a tin cup, steam curling upward from the broth he poured. When he held it out, she reached, her fingers brushing his knuckles. The brief contact startled her with its warmth, sending a rush of heat through her chilled body. She sipped, burning her tongue, yet the knot in her chest loosened. He settled onto the floor a short distance away, his gaze fixed on the flames, his silence heavy but not suffocating. Olivia studied him through the veil of firelight, the angle of his jaw, the quiet strength in his posture, the way his hands rested on his knees as though even in stillness he bore the weight of the world. She found herself busying her hands with small tasks, folding her shawl, brushing melted snow from her boots, arranging her satchel neatly against the wall. The fire crackled, the storm moaned against the walls, and yet the silence between them shifted. It was no longer cold, no longer a cage. It was a space of respect, of dignity, of something unspoken that began to heal the ache of being unseen. When night deepened, she gathered the courage to whisper, "Where should I sleep?" He pointed toward the bed, then without a word pulled a blanket from the chest. Spreading it upon the floor near the hearth, he laid himself down with his back to her, leaving her the bed. The gesture struck her harder than any words could. Relief ached in her chest as she slipped beneath the quilt, the creak of the frame magnified in the silence. She stared at the ceiling, the flicker of the fire painting shifting patterns on the beams. Fear had haunted her since the station, but as she listened to the rhythm of his breathing, to the fire's crackle, to the wind clawing outside, she found no fear in this silence, only the fragile calm of knowing he had given her comfort without demand. Sleep would not come easily. At last she rose, padding softly to the hearth. She found him upright, his blanket draped around his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the window where snow swirled like a veil against the dark. His profile in the glow was both stern and weary, as though carved from the same logs that held the cabin upright. She murmured, almost without thought, "You're watching." He turned slightly, the firelight glimmering in his eyes, revealing not hardness, but vigilance, a presence steady enough to keep the storm itself at bay. He gave a single nod, and something inside her loosened, trembling like a string drawn too tight. She lowered herself onto the rug beside him, the warmth of the flames brushing her skin. For the first time since stepping from the train, she did not feel invisible. Time blurred, minutes stretching like threads of quiet harmony. Her eyelids grew heavy, her body leaning, until her head found his shoulder. She felt the shift of muscle beneath her cheek, the careful restraint of a man unused to closeness. And yet his arm rose, steady and strong, to hold her where she had fallen. He did not breathe too loud, did not move to disturb her, but wrapped his silence around her like a vow. In that moment, the storm beyond the cabin walls ceased to matter. There was only warmth, only the healing rhythm of his presence, only the fragile promise of belonging where none had been offered before. By morning the storm had eased, leaving the valley buried in white silence. Smoke curled from distant cabins like timid prayers, and the bell of the station tolled faintly across the snow. Olivia stirred beneath the quilt, finding the bed empty. Through the frost-rimmed window, she saw him already outside, his breath rising in plumes as he split wood with calm, precise strikes. Each blow echoed with the strength of survival, each motion steady as if his very labor was a shield against the cold. And though her heart trembled with uncertainty, she felt the first seed of peace settle inside her chest. Their story had only begun, but in that quiet morning she understood that love could be carved not in words, but in the silent choices that held her safe when the storm raged. The sound of the axe rose again, steady, unyielding, and with each strike she felt the rhythm of a bond that might yet weather the harshest winter. And so the day turned, carrying them further into a journey neither had chosen by the world's design, but one that now belonged to them alone, a path already stitched by silence, firelight, and the healing weight of a man's vow unspoken. The days settled into a rhythm carved by necessity and silence. The cabin, their fragile world, the wilderness, its vast and watchful boundary. Each dawn began with the thud of his axe outside, each strike measured as though he were cutting more than wood, as though he was splitting away the weight of every whisper that had followed him from town. Olivia would wake to the scent of smoke and pine, her breath clouding the air as she stoked the embers he had left glowing, feeding them until the fire stretched its warmth across the room. She had not been raised to such labor, yet her fingers learned clumsily but quickly how to kindle damp wood until it caught, how to boil beans until their starch softened into something sustaining, how to mend seams in silence, the thread trembling between her hands. At first, their exchanges were wordless. He moved around her with quiet care, leaving space where others might crowd, offering tasks without command. When her hands slipped on the knife while cutting kindling, the blade grazing her skin, he was beside her before she had drawn breath to cry out. His enormous hand closed around her wrist, his thumb brushing the shallow wound with a delicacy she would not have thought possible from a man whose strength seemed made to break. He bound her finger with rough cloth, his movements slow, almost reverent, as if to remind her she was not alone in her frailty. When he met her gaze, even for a heartbeat, she saw not menace, but the pulse of a soul who had carried silence too long. The storm outside sealed them in, snow pressing against the shutters like a siege, yet within those walls something softer began to stir. Their gestures became a language, each one a fragment of trust. She left the larger portion of broth in his bowl, pretending not to notice when he quietly pushed it back to her. He placed an extra log on the fire before she stirred from bed, so the room would greet her with warmth rather than cold. Once she woke to find him hunched over her shawl, his massive fingers awkwardly threading a needle, mending the tear she had hidden. Her throat had ached with unshed words then, not of gratitude alone, but of recognition, that strength could bend itself to gentleness, that silence could carry devotion. Yet beneath these tender threads the world's whispers lingered. Olivia felt them at night when the wind clawed at the cabin walls, as though judgment itself had followed them into the pines. Too tall, too savage, too desperate, echoes that pressed against her chest until she could not breathe. Sometimes, in the half-dark, she imagined shadows gathering just beyond the door, eyes peering, waiting for her to falter. And yet, in those moments, his presence steadied her. The quiet rhythm of his breathing, the surety of his watch by the window, as though his very stillness promised that nothing would pass through those walls without meeting him first. It was during one such morning, her fingers fumbling with needle and thread as she patched the sleeve of his coat, that she broke the silence with words that quivered like a confession. "They will never forgive me," she whispered, her eyes lowered to the cloth. The room held its breath. He paused at the door, his hand braced against the latch, snow spilling in through the crack of light. For a long moment he stood unmoving, then spoke, his voice deep and resonant, startling in its gravity. Tall men cast long shadows. Folks fear shadows. The sound of it shivered through her, as though the earth itself had spoken, and she realized then how long he had carried such truth without release. She pressed the needle through cloth with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from the healing weight of knowing he had finally trusted her with his voice. Later, when he led her outside to teach her how to ride his bay horse, the snow creaking beneath their boots, she felt the trembling of both fear and anticipation. The reins slipped against her hands, stiff with nerves, until his palm closed gently over hers, guiding with quiet assurance. The horse shifted, muscles alive beneath her, and she clutched his arm for balance. He steadied her without effort, his warmth bleeding through layers of winter cloth, and though he did not smile, his eyes softened, a glimmer of something unspoken passing between them. Her laugh, startled and bright, burst into the cold air, and it startled him more than the horse's movement. He turned sharply, his gaze fixed on her, and though he said nothing, the softness there was enough. Nights blurred into a fragile peace, the fire their center, storms their constant chorus. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought her asleep, his expression unreadable but not cold, as though he was measuring the weight of what had been entrusted to him. Other times she would wake in the stillness to find his arm drawn protectively around her, tentative at first, then firmer, as though he had accepted a vow only his silence could keep. Each gesture, Each glance stitched something healing between them, a bond forged not by declarations, but by survival, by choice, by the warmth of presence where loneliness had once lived. Yet peace is never untouched. The storm outside was not the only one waiting. In the brittle light of dawn, Olivia stepped onto the porch to fetch water, her shawl wrapped tight, her breath shuddering in the air. And there, across the clearing, half veiled by pines, stood a figure, broad-shouldered, motionless, watching. She froze, the bucket slipping from her grasp, the clang swallowed by snow. When she blinked, the man turned, vanishing into the trees, leaving only tracks that the wind quickly devoured. Her heart pounded as she stumbled back inside, trembling. He rose from the hearth at once, his gaze sharpening on her face, and though she did not speak, he understood. His height filled the room as he moved to the window, his body taut with vigilance, and in the silence that followed, both knew the truth. Judgment had not been left behind at the station. It had only followed them deeper into the wilderness, waiting for the moment to strike. The world outside glittered under the cruel moon that night, silver edges sharpening every drift of snow, but the weight pressing against the cabin was not the storm. It was the presence of men who believed choice was theirs to claim, who believed love could be broken by fear. And though Olivia trembled, though the whispers of doubt gnawed at her, she felt the steady presence beside her, the warmth of his silence wrapping her like a vow. The storm within and without would soon collide, testing whether their fragile bond could hold. But for now, in the hush between crackling logs and the press of shadows at the window, she leaned into the healing truth of what had begun. She had chosen him, and he had chosen not to let go. The snow did not relent, pressing against the shutters as if the world itself sought to bury their fragile sanctuary. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its glow carving gold across rough-hewn walls, its warmth reaching just far enough to brush the edges of fear. Olivia sat at the table, her hands folded tightly, listening to the silence stretch until it became unbearable. He was near the window, his body still as carved stone, the weight of vigilance shaping every line of his frame. She could feel the storm in him, though his face remained unreadable, as though the very act of guarding had become his breath. The figure she had seen that morning haunted her still, an image etched into her chest, and though she longed to speak, her words lay heavy in her throat. When the first knock came, it shattered the quiet like the crack of a rifle. The door trembled beneath the blow, the sound ricocheting through the cabin. Olivia startled, her hand clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. A second strike followed, louder, demanding, and then voices broke through the night, coarse and filled with malice. "Open up. She doesn't belong here. No place for her with you." Nathaniel's drawl cut the air, thick with drink, thick with hatred, the cadence of a man who had come not to reason, but to destroy. Boots crunched in the snow outside, circling the cabin, the mutter of men emboldened by numbers, rising like the growl of wolves. Chenoa rose with a calmness that seemed to brace the very walls. He laid one massive hand on her shoulder, the touch steady, grounding, before he moved toward the door. Olivia's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming fast, but the warmth of his hand lingered, healing her fear enough to keep her upright. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in, moonlight spilling across the threshold, illuminating 5 men in the clearing, their rifles slung, their faces twisted in drink and anger. Nathaniel stood at the front, smirking, his breath pluming white into the night. "You hear me, savage?" he called. "She belongs with her own kind. Let the girl go." The silence that followed was thick as frost. Chenoa did not speak. His silence was heavier than any words, his shadow stretching across the drifts until he seemed more myth than man. Olivia stepped forward, trembling, yet her voice carried into the brittle night, fragile but fierce. "I chose him." The words echoed into the clearing, striking harder than the wind, sharper than the cold. The men shifted uneasily, muttering, yet Nathaniel sneered, his lip curling. "Chose him out of pity. Girl, you'll regret it." He raised his hand, signaling his men forward. "Take her back. Let's end this fool's game." One man advanced, rifle in hand, but Chenoa's arm shot out, seizing the barrel mid-motion. In one fluid twist, the weapon clattered into the snow. The man stumbled back, cursing. Nathaniel lunged, fist swinging wild, but Chenoa blocked with effortless strength, the blow glancing off his arm like rain striking stone. His other hand thrust forward, shoving Nathaniel into the drifts, his body folding under the sheer force. The clearing erupted. Shouts, fists, boots tearing into snow, the crack of wood against flesh. Olivia's cry split the air as two men rushed him together, but the giant met them with power honed by silence and survival. His fists struck like thunder, each blow resounding into the night, sending bodies tumbling into the white. Nathaniel rose again, blood streaking his jaw, his eyes fevered with rage. From his belt he drew a knife, the blade glinting sharp under the moon. He lunged, but before steel could find flesh, Olivia's voice rang out, clearer than any weapon. "Enough!" She stepped forward, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her body trembling but unyielding, her face lit with a fire that startled even herself. The men faltered, frozen by the force of her words. She stood between them and the man they sought to destroy, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her defiance. "I chose him," she said again, her tone low, unwavering. "You will not take me." The knife wavered in Nathaniel's hand, his breath ragged, his anger clashing with disbelief. And then another voice broke through the night. The weary authority of Sheriff Abel, stepping from the trees, his rifle in hand. His gaze swept the scene, the blood staining the snow, the girl standing firm before the giant. His jaw tightened, his tone heavy with finality. "She's made her choice. Let it be." Nathaniel spat into the snow, fury twisting his face, but the sheriff's stare held him still, pinning his bravado like a nail through wood. One by one, the men backed away, dragging their wounded pride and bruised bodies into the trees, muttering as they went. Nathaniel lingered longest, his glare burning into the night, before at last he turned, his shadow shrinking into darkness. Silence fell again, broken only by Olivia's ragged breath. The snow glistening with scuffs and blood, a battlefield etched in white. Chenoa stood tall, his chest heaving, his fists raw, his eyes searching hers, not with triumph, but with a question, whether she would now see him as the savage the world insisted he was. But Olivia stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for his. She took his bruised knuckles in her small grip, lifting them between them both, her gaze steady. "You protected me," she whispered, her voice soft but fierce. "Not because you had to, but because you are mine, and I am yours." His breath caught, the words striking deeper than any blade. Slowly, almost reverently, He lowered himself to one knee in the snow, his brow pressing gently to hers, the tremor in his body betraying the years of silence that cracked open in that moment. At last his voice came, low and hoarse, her name breaking from him like a vow. Olivia. Tears warmed her cheeks despite the cold, her body trembling not from fear, but from the healing fire that filled her. She leaned into him, their embrace steady, unshaken, and though the storm of judgment raged still in the world beyond, here in the clearing they were no longer shadows of scorn. They were fire against the frost, chosen against all odds, bound by a love born not of convenience but of defiance, and sealed in snow under the watch of the indifferent moon. The sheriff lingered at the edge of the trees, his weary eyes softening for the first time, his hat tipping in a gesture of respect before he vanished again into the dark. And when at last the clearing emptied, when only the snow bore witness to what had passed, Olivia clung to him, her voice breaking but unshaken. "They'll never stop." His arms folded around her, immense and steady, his voice firm with a promise that wrapped her like the fire's warmth. "Then neither will I." Above them, the moon slipped from its shroud of cloud, bathing the cabin and the scarred battlefield in silver. The night was no gentler, the world no kinder, but in that embrace Olivia felt the healing warmth of a future forged in defiance, carried by dignity, and made unbreakable by choice. The storm had not ended. It had only begun. But now they would face it together, their silence no longer emptiness but vow, their love no longer a fragile whisper but a fire that could endure beyond judgment. Winter tightened its grip upon the valley until the land itself seemed carved from silence. Snow rose high against the walls of the cabin, swallowing fence posts, burying paths, sealing them from the world beyond. Pines bent under the weight of ice, their branches groaning low, as if the forest bowed to the endless white. Within the small cabin, firelight became their heartbeat, its glow the rhythm of survival, its warmth the pulse that bound them closer than any vow. Olivia woke each morning to the sound of his labor, the steady thud of the axe outside, the scrape of logs hauled in, the creak of leather as he bent against the weight of necessity. She would rise to tend the fire, to warm broth or boil beans, her hands growing steady with practice, her movements less uncertain with each passing day. Their lives wove together in the quiet fabric of survival, his strength anchoring the walls, her diligence softening the edges of solitude. What had begun as silence grew into a language of gestures, small and healing, more intimate than words could ever shape. He left wood stacked higher by the door so she need not strain to carry it. She mended the seams of his coat, patching them with clumsy stitches, only to find he had already repaired her shawl with his enormous, awkward fingers. She prepared his bowl, always trying to give him the larger portion, only for him to slide it gently back, his dark eyes betraying no argument, only quiet insistence. He rose earlier, so that by the time she stirred, the kettle already steamed. She lingered later, ensuring his bed of blankets by the fire was laid smooth, though he never once accepted the comfort of the bed. Each act was a vow unspoken, weaving threads of devotion in the hush between storms. One afternoon, as the snow hissed against the shutters, she tried her hand at splitting kindling. The blade slipped, biting shallow into her skin. Before the blood could stain the snow, his hand was there, wrapping around hers, firm but unbearably gentle. He bound her finger with strips of cloth, his thumb brushing the wound as though afraid even his touch might hurt her. When his eyes lifted to meet hers, she saw not the silence that once seemed impenetrable, but the depth of a man who had carried his strength alone too long. In that look lay the healing truth. His silence was never absence, but restraint. A fortress built not to keep her out, but to keep her safe. The nights grew longer, the storms louder. Wind rattled the shutters as though trying to tear the cabin apart. Yet, within those four walls, there was a strange kind of peace. Sometimes she would find him mending her boots by the fire, his hands far too large for the tiny stitches, yet determined all the same. Other times she caught him watching her as she brushed her hair, his eyes softening, not with desire alone, but with wonder, as though he could not fathom how he had been chosen. She did not always speak when she noticed, but the warmth of his gaze lingered, sinking into her bones like the fire's glow. And sometimes, in the deep hours of night, she would stir to find his arm around her. At first, his embrace was tentative, a brush of warmth barely touching. But as the nights deepened, the storm pressing harder against the cabin, his hold grew firmer, as though he had accepted the unspoken vow that he would not let her weather the world alone. She leaned into him without fear, her breath mingling with his, her cheek warmed by the steady rhythm of his chest. In those hours she discovered what no words had ever given her, the healing of being seen, not for beauty, nor for worth measured by others, but for her choice, for her defiance, for her heart. Yet even within this fragile peace, shadows pressed near. She heard them in the storm's howl, in the memory of Nathaniel's sneer, in the whispers that would not die. Sometimes she imagined the townsfolk gathering in the trees, eyes like knives, waiting. And still, when she trembled, his presence steadied her, his silence reminding her that storms might rage, but within this space she was safe. It was during one such storm, when the fire burned low and the cabin shook under the wind's fury, that she found herself staring into the flames, her voice breaking from her chest like a prayer. "They will never forgive me." The words hung heavy, dissolving into smoke. He stood by the door, his hand braced against the frame, his shadow tall against the wall. For a long time he said nothing. Then his voice, low and resonant, filled the room. Tall men cast long shadows. Folks fear shadows. The sound of his words struck her deeper than any silence. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of his truth. He had lived under judgment his whole life, carrying it as one carries frostbite, silent, enduring, scarring. Yet now he had given her that truth, not to wound, but to share its weight. In that moment she understood more than before. Their bond was not born of chance, but of defiance against the world's cruelty. Later, when he guided her hand to the reins of his horse, teaching her to ride in the clearing, she felt the full gravity of what it meant to be chosen. The reins slipped, her body tensed, but his palm covered hers, guiding with patient strength. When she wavered, she clutched his arm, the heat of his body grounding her in the brittle air. And when she laughed, startled and alive, he turned sharply, his gaze catching hers with a softness that thawed something within him. For the first time she saw not the stone mask he wore, but the flicker of warmth, fragile yet undeniable. Days folded into nights, storms into silences, until the rhythm of their life felt less like survival and more like a fragile symphony. She found herself humming softly while she worked, and though he never joined, he listened, his eyes softening, as though her voice stitched something back together in him. When she lay against him at night, her head on his chest, she could feel the beat of his heart, steady as the fire, anchoring her to a truth that was healing in its constancy. He was no longer only hers to choose. He had chosen her as well. But peace is never eternal. On the fourth morning after a storm, Olivia stepped onto the porch with a bucket in her hands. The air stung sharp against her face, the clearing white with moonlit frost. She froze. At the edge of the trees stood a figure, broad-shouldered, motionless, watching. For a breathless moment, the world narrowed to his stillness. Then he turned, vanishing into the pines, leaving only tracks that the wind began to devour. Her breath came ragged, the bucket slipping into the snow. When she stumbled back inside, her face pale, Chenoa rose from the fire at once. He did not need her words. He read the fear in her trembling hands, the pallor of her cheeks. His frame filled the room as he moved to the window, his gaze sharpening into the dark. For a long moment he stood unmoving, every line of his body rigid with vigilance. And in the silence she knew. The storm outside was not the only one gathering. Judgment had followed them into the wilderness. The world had not let them go. That night the snow gleamed silver beneath the moon, sharpening drifts into cruel edges, but the weight pressing against the cabin was no storm. It was the certainty that their love, fragile and healing, would be tested again, that the whispers of others were not finished, that the choice she had made on the platform would be tried by fire. Yet even in that heaviness, when her fear tightened her chest, she felt his presence steady beside her. His silence was no longer absence, it was vow. His arm brushed against hers, strong and unyielding, and she leaned closer, breathing in the warmth of the truth she now knew with every fibre of her being. Storms may come, but she had chosen him, and he had chosen never to let her go. The days that followed pressed down with a silence heavy enough to feel like stone. The figure Olivia had seen near the tree line never left her mind, lingering in every gust of wind, every shifting shadow across the snow. She tried to push it aside, tried to focus on the rhythm of survival, the splitting of wood, the boiling of beans, the endless patching of garments that had already seen too many winters. But the memory clung to her like a second skin. Even when she smiled, even when she forced warmth into her voice, there was a tremor underneath, as if the earth itself had cracked. Chenoa sensed it. He always did. He never asked, never demanded, but his eyes followed her with the gravity of a sentinel. When she stirred from sleep in the middle of the night, he was there, sitting upright by the hearth, his silhouette tall against the firelight. His silence had changed. It no longer spoke of distance but of vigilance. He carried her fear in his stillness, bore the weight of her trembling with the calm of someone who had lived his life as a shield. She came to understand that the very silence that had once unsettled her was the silence that now kept her safe. The whispers of town echoed even here. When they ventured into Main Street for supplies, she felt the weight of every gaze pressing upon her. Women bent their heads together, their mouths sharp with scorn. Men leaned in doorways, their eyes calculating, their grins edged with cruelty. Children pointed openly, mimicking the breadth of his shoulders, their laughter high and cruel. Too tall, too savage. The words spread like sparks over dry grass. Yet she did not falter. She walked at his side, her chin lifted, her hand brushing against his until their fingers entwined. The warmth of his palm steadied her, and though the whispers thickened, though their stares burned, she felt something more enduring than shame, a healing strength drawn from the choice she had already made. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with scrutiny. Amelia Hensley's smile was all sharp edges as her eyes flicked between Olivia and the giant who filled the small shop with his stillness. "Strange pairing," she murmured, voice pitched high enough for all to hear. "A girl like you, tied to a man like him. Folks will talk." Olivia's pulse thundered, but her voice, though soft, did not waver. "They already do." The room stirred with murmurs. Nathaniel stepping forward from the doorway, his swagger soaked in whiskey, his grin sharpened with malice. His words slashed the air. Pretty little Olivia Mayfield choosing the giant savage. Desperation makes folk blind. Laughter followed, men echoing his cruelty like a chorus. For a moment she thought Chenoa would strike. She felt the storm gathering in him, the tightening of his shoulders, the fire flickering in his dark eyes, but he did not move. He carried his silence like a blade, sharp and steady, holding back the violence they wanted to see. And in that stillness, Olivia acted. She reached for his hand, gripping it firmly, lifting her chin so all could see. "He is mine," she said, her voice trembling, but fierce enough to split the air. The laughter faltered. Nathaniel's smirk twitched, his bravado cracking. "For now," he muttered, but he stepped back, the swagger in his boots suddenly hollow. When they left the mercantile, the snow caught on her lashes, but her vision burned clear. The whispers still followed, softer now, edged with disbelief. She ignored them. She focused only on the steady warmth of his hand in hers, the unyielding strength of his silence, the vow that pressed against her bones every time their fingers locked. Their wagon rolled through the streets, the storm swelling in their wake, but she no longer cared for the world's eyes. Each step they took together was defiance, each breath a declaration. That night, back in the cabin, she moved with a quiet energy, setting down the flour and salt, her hands lingering on the rough sackcloth as though grounding herself. He carried the supplies in without a word, his movements slower, as though the weight of the day pressed down upon him. She watched him, her heart aching with a tenderness that grew too heavy to contain. When he turned, his gaze found hers, dark and searching, filled with unspoken questions. She did not look away. She stepped closer, her voice a whisper but firm as stone. "They will never stop." He nodded, the faintest movement, as though he had long known what she only now understood. The fire popped in the silence. Snow rattled against the shutters, but between them there was a steadiness, a vow unshaken by the storm beyond. She felt it in the way his hand brushed the table near hers, not touching, but close enough to burn like a promise. She felt it in the way his eyes lingered, steady and unflinching, and she knew in that breathless moment that their bond was no longer fragile. It had been tempered in fire, sealed in defiance, and would endure whatever shadow came to test it. When she lay down that night, the world outside pressing cold and merciless, she found his arm around her once more, not tentative now, but firm, protective, certain. She nestled closer, her breath sinking with his, and whispered into the hush, "Then neither will I." His silence answered like a vow, deep and healing, a fortress against the storm. And though the world beyond might never forgive, Never relent. She felt the truth settle inside her like fire in her chest. They had chosen one another, and that choice was enough to stand against everything. The snow thickened, cloaking the valley in white, but within their cabin the warmth of defiance burned bright, carrying them forward into whatever trial awaited. Two souls joined not by chance, nor law, nor mercy of others, but by the fierce tenderness of love chosen freely against all odds. The storm had broken for a brief span, leaving the valley veiled in brittle moonlight, silver sharpening the edges of every drift. Yet the peace it promised was hollow, too thin to hold, too brittle to believe. Olivia felt it in her chest as she stirred the pot above the fire, the silence of the woods pressing too deliberately against the walls, a silence too watchful to be chance. Chenoa sat by the window, his frame tall and rigid, shoulders drawn like a sentinel carved out of the night. And his eyes moved with a rhythm of vigilance, each flicker toward the tree line carrying the weight of instinct sharpened by years of survival. Neither spoke, yet both knew. The shadow she had glimpsed days before had not been a phantom. The first knock shook the cabin like the crack of thunder. Olivia jumped, nearly spilling the ladle from her hand, her breath catching hard in her throat. The second blow was louder, rattling the latch, followed by a voice steeped in drink and malice. "Open up! Ain't no place for her here." Nathaniel's drawl slashed through the night, his words thick, his hatred swelling behind them. Outside, boots crunched in the snow, circling, voices rising in chorus, men emboldened by numbers, by whiskey, by cruelty. Their shadows loomed against the window, shifting like wolves closing in on prey. Chenoa rose, his presence steady, unhurried. His hand brushed Olivia's shoulder, the brief touch grounding her trembling, before he moved to the door. She pressed her hands against the table, her pulse hammering so fiercely it seemed to echo in the walls. When he opened the door, the night surged in, cold and sharp, moonlight slicing across the threshold. 5 men stood in the clearing, rifles slung, faces twisted in anger. Nathaniel at the front smirked, his teeth bared like a predator savoring the strike. "Come out, savage," he barked. "Let the girl go. She ain't yours to keep." The silence that followed was heavier than stone, stretched so taut it seemed it might shatter. Chenoa did not answer, did not move, his shadow towering across the snow like something more than human. Olivia stepped forward, trembling but unyielding, her voice carrying into the bitter night with a clarity that split the air. "I chose him." The words rang fragile yet fierce, a defiance no storm could smother. The men shifted, some muttering uneasily, but Nathaniel sneered, his lip curling. "Chose him out of pity." "Girl, you'll regret it." He motioned to his men. "Take her back. End this fool's game." One advanced, rifle glinting under the moon, but Chenoa's arm shot out with lightning strength, seizing the barrel. In a single twist, the weapon fell into the snow. The man stumbled back, cursing. Nathaniel lunged, fist swinging, but Chenoa blocked with effortless grace, the blow deflecting like rain against rock. His other hand drove forward, shoving Nathaniel into the drift with a force that shook the clearing. The fight erupted, shouts, fists, snow scattering under boots. Olivia's cry pierced the night as 2 men rushed him together, but the giant met them with the power of years carved in silence, his fists striking like thunder, each blow resonant, each movement honed to survival. A man collapsed in the snow, groaning. Another stumbled back, fear overtaking fury. Nathaniel rose again, blood streaking his jaw, eyes fevered with desperation. He drew a knife, the blade gleaming white under the moon. He lunged, his rage spilling wild, but Olivia's voice cut sharper than steel. "Enough!" She stepped forward, shawl falling from her shoulders, her body trembling but her face alight with fire. She stood between them, small against the breadth of the night, but unshaken. "I chose him. You will not take me." The words silenced the clearing. Even Nathaniel faltered, knife wavering, his fury clashing with disbelief. The air burned with tension until another voice broke through the night. Sheriff Abel's, weary but commanding. He stepped from the trees, rifle steady, his gaze sweeping the chaos, the bruised men, the blood-staining snow, the girl standing before the giant. "That's enough," he said, his tone final as stone. "She's made her choice. Let it be." Nathaniel spat, fury twisting his face, but the sheriff's eyes pinned him, sharp and immovable. One by one, the men withdrew, dragging their shame and bruises into the trees. Nathaniel lingered longest, his glare burning, before at last he turned, his shadow shrinking into darkness. Silence fell, broken only by Olivia's ragged breaths, the snow beneath them marked with scuffs and blood, the remnants of a battlefield carved in white. Chenoa stood tall, his fists raw, his chest heaving, his eyes searching hers not with triumph, but with fear, that she might now see in him the savage others claimed he was. But Olivia stepped closer, her hand trembling as she lifted his bruised knuckles into her grasp. "You protected me," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute, her gaze steady. "Not because you had to, but because you are mine, and I am yours." His breath caught, the words breaking through the silence like dawn. Slowly, almost reverently, he sank to one knee in the snow, lowering his head until his brow pressed gently to hers. His voice came at last, hoarse with restraint, her name leaving his lips like a vow. "Olivia." Her tears warmed the frozen air as her hands cradled his, their embrace sealing what no storm could undo. The sheriff lingered at the tree line, his eyes softening with a respect unspoken. He tipped his hat once, then turned, his figure fading into the night. When all others were gone, Olivia clung to Chenoa, her voice breaking into the hush. "They'll never stop." His arms folded around her, immense and steady, his voice answering with the certainty of fire. "Then neither will I." The moon spilled silver across them, bathing their embrace, washing the scars of battle in light. The night was no gentler, the world no kinder, but in that clearing Olivia felt the healing warmth of a future forged in defiance, a love carried not by chance but by choice, and tempered strong enough to outlast every storm yet to come. The days after the clash bled into one another like ink spreading through water, slow and irreversible. Snow buried the scars of footprints, smoothing over the battlefield as if the earth itself sought to forget. But the memory of it lingered in Olivia's chest, the way Nathaniel's knife gleamed in the moonlight, the sound of fists cracking against bone, the fear that had crawled up her spine and nearly strangled her. She woke some nights with her breath caught, her fingers clutched around emptiness, until she felt the reassuring weight of Chenoa's arm around her, steady and silent. His presence was an anchor, and though the storm outside roared, within his embrace she felt the healing warmth of safety. as though the world's cruelty could not breach the quiet vow he had made to her. Life resumed its rhythm, but it was no longer the fragile balance of before. Something had shifted. The cabin did not merely shelter them, it became their sanctuary, a fortress built not of wood and stone alone, but of choice and defiance. Olivia's hands learned new rhythms, kneading dough, mending with confidence rather than hesitation, stoking the fire with ease. Each gesture became an offering, not out of obligation, but out of love. Chenoa's silence softened into presence, his gaze more often finding hers, not to weigh her worth, but to steady himself in the quiet recognition that she had not faltered. At times she caught him watching her with something raw and almost vulnerable, as if he was still unlearning the years of rejection that had branded him unworthy. She answered with her touch, her small hand resting on his scarred knuckles, her voice whispering his name like a hymn, her laughter spilling into the cabin as though joy itself were a rebellion. They ventured into town less often, but when they did, they walked side by side, hands entwined, defying the whispers that followed. Men stared, women whispered, children pointed, but Olivia's chin did not lower. Her voice, though rarely raised, was firm in its defiance. She had chosen, and she would not yield. Chenoa's silence beside her was no longer a wall. It was a shield, a fortress of dignity that made her steps lighter. Though Nathaniel's shadow lingered in muttered threats, though Amelia's sharp eyes gleamed with cruel curiosity, the bond between Olivia and the giant held steady, forged in fire, weathered by snow. Each look they shared was a vow renewed, each step through the town a reminder that love was not granted by others, but claimed in defiance of them. Winter deepened. Snow fell in relentless veils, the nights stretched long, and storms clawed at the shutters with a hunger that seemed endless. Yet within the cabin warmth grew, not only from fire, but from the quiet healing of two souls who had found in one another what the world had denied them. Olivia would hum as she worked, soft melodies that wrapped the air in tenderness. Chenoa would pause his labor to listen, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that carried no threat, only reverence. Some nights, when she rested her head against his chest, she felt his heart's rhythm beneath her ear, steady and strong, a sound more sacred than any prayer she had ever whispered. He rarely spoke, but in the curve of his arm around her, in the way his body bent to shield her from every draught, every shadow, she heard his voice clearer than words. "I will not let you fall." And as the days unfolded, they discovered that love was not always born in grand gestures or fiery confessions. Sometimes it was in the way he set the axe down to rap her cut finger with gentleness, or the way she pressed his bruised hands to her lips after he returned from the fight, or the way they shared silence, not as absence, but as presence. Healing seeped into the cracks left by scorn, and dignity blossomed where shame had once lived. Their bond was not fragile anymore. It was fire, alive and relentless, a force that turned the coldest nights into something survivable, something radiant. Yet even in their quiet sanctuary, the world beyond waited, watching. They knew whispers would not end, that storms would gather again, that Nathaniel's fury had not burned out, but merely receded into the dark. But together they faced it, unflinching. When Olivia whispered, "They'll never stop," Chenoa's answer came not as a cry, but as steady as the ground beneath them. "Then neither will I." That vow became the breath they lived by, the truth that carried them through nights of howling wind and days of labor that left their bodies aching but their spirits unbroken. On one such night, when the moonlight spilled silver across the snow and the fire cast golden warmth across their faces, Olivia lifted her gaze to him and saw not the giant mocked by others, not the savage scorned by whispers, but the man who had given her dignity without demand, protection without possession, love without condition. Her heart swelled with gratitude so fierce it broke into tears, tears she did not hide, tears he brushed away with a hand that shook not with weakness, but with tenderness too vast for words. In his eyes she saw her reflection not as plain, not as overlooked, but as chosen, cherished, irreplaceable. And so their story became less about survival and more about love's defiance, the healing fire that burned against the frost of judgment, the tender strength that grew between silence and whispers. Their union, scorned by many, became their sanctuary, a truth written in the snow, sealed by the storm, carried by choice. It was not ease that bound them, but endurance, not approval that sustained them, but defiance. And in that defiance they found joy, they found belonging, they found a love that even the harshest winter could not bury. If you have walked this path with them, if their story stirred warmth within you in the midst of your own storms, I invite you to let your heart speak. Share your thoughts in a comment. Leave your voice where theirs has lingered. If their love has kindled a spark of healing in you, let it be known. Like, subscribe, and stay close, so that these fires of tenderness and strength continue to burn. For every heart that chooses love against the world's whispers, every voice that refuses to be silenced, keeps alive the truth. Love, once chosen, cannot be undone.